So Saee Koranne-Khandekar has been a food writer and culinary consultant since 2008, when she firmly put her life as instructional designer behind. We will talk about this. Her primary interests include the study of regional cuisines in their historical and socio-cultural contexts and the relationship between food and literature. Her first book, the Gore Family Cookbook, was a privately circulated cookbook exploring a family's culinary heritage over a period of 100 years. Crumbs, Bread Stories and Recipes for the Indian Kitchen, Hatchet India, 2016, explores bread making in the context of local ingredients. We'll be speaking about that. And climatic conditions, while a second award-winning book, Pangat, A Feast, Hatchet India, 2019, attempts to discover the cuisines of Maharashtra. Welcome, Saee.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for doing this despite all that is happening. And let me address that as well. Why are we speaking of food writing at a time when there is a health crisis around us? I believe that only if you're healthy can you help others, and that includes mental health and diversion as well. And that if in some way our online program and the YouTube recording that we will produce from it will give people that diversion, will give people that cultural dose, that cultural flavor that is otherwise lacking, then we will have done our job in this difficult time. So without further ado, let's welcome Saee Koranne-Khandekar. Saee, 1 second. Right, so I just, okay, Saee, you need to give me permission to start my video. Or you can make me the host, that's okay. Again, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Does that work? Yeah.
Yes. So I just got my list of questions. Saee, let's start off. You've written two mass-published books and one privately circulated book. And it's a very, very fascinating journey that you've had as a writer, specifically as a food writer. And that's a matter of great curiosity for me, and I'm sure for a lot of people. How did you make the transition into food writing? How did you become a culinary consultant and a food writer? What were the steps for other people who might be wishing to pursue this path?
I'm not sure I'm the best example for that, because I sort of landed into this quite accidentally. So I didn't start off by studying food. I studied English literature. I went to the University of Mumbai. I did my MA. I studied Ranjit Hoskote in my poetry. So I did.
Yeah.
I know. So I did that, and then I, went through the motions. So I did. I worked as a sub-editor, and then I studied a little more, e-learning, instructional design, etc. And then I worked as an instructional designer for a while. A little later, when I got married and set up my own house and finally had my own kitchen, I realized that this is the time when I need to start documenting what I'm cooking, because I'd always been fond of food. I'd always been fond of cooking, but one hadn't really thought about writing things down, because you just cook as the inspiration strikes. Around this time, blogging had entered the writing world, and for good, for bad, whatever, but it provided a platform for people like us who were new to writing. And so I started a blog, and I used to write what I cooked for dinner that day, or something that I found in the market and stuff like that. And I still had my day job as an instructional designer. Over a period of time, I realized that writing about food is giving me far more pleasure and far more happiness than a 9-to-5 job. And so I quit it. And as luck would have it, a couple of publications approached me and they asked me. So incidentally, the first column that I ever wrote was for Lok Satta, and it was in Marathi. And it was, unfamiliar territory, because I wasn't very used to writing in Marathi. So I used to actually write it in English, the whole article, and then sit and translate it myself and then send it to my mother to make sure that, I've got the references right and, the language and all of that. So that's how it pretty much started, and I got into it quite accidentally. But yeah, so I don't have any formal training in food writing or writing at all, actually.
But so how did you sort of bring yourself into the mold of food writing? You must have read a lot. You must have.
Yeah. So, one is an obsessive reader anyway. And when it comes to food, I think it goes way back in the sense that even as a child, I would read my mother's recipe books like one reads novels. And I would find stories in them. And more often than not, they were your standard issue, it was a tagla dalal or something that a relative brought from abroad, a dessert cookbook or something like that. But there were all of these fascinating stories hidden, even in those recipes. So I was always interested in imagining food, So I think before I actually learned how to cook in the kitchen, I was cooking in my head. A lot of us do, I think. We imagine flavors, we imagine textures and the context in which, these dishes are prepared and enjoyed. So yeah, I think that's pretty much where it started. And then I felt that, if I am to make this, reasonable, then I need to study a little more about the food. One can't really learn writing, but one can learn about food. So I went on and studied a little more. So when I was in college, I'd already done a 2-year certificate course in bakery and confectionery. So I was familiar with the jargon, etc. But at one point, I decided that, okay, so I gifted myself a course in aroma and flavor. So that was quite a revelation.
Wonderful. And you write about it so beautifully in, I think, Crumbs. You write about the grumpy Parsi teacher.
Yeah. Yes. Mr. Nimbuwala, he was already very old when he was teaching us, and he could barely, stand and show us the kneading techniques, etc. But one learned so much from him because he was a very old school, very regimental sort of a teacher, in the sense that despite having a stand mixer in the laboratory or the kitchen, he would make us whisk eggs for a large cake using 2 forks. We weren't even allowed to use whisk. And more often than not, when you do that, and if you don't do a bloody good job, then the cake is going to turn out really flat and terrible. And most of us flunked that exam, I can tell you. But that's how we learned. And I think that made us better cooks.
Yes. So you started off as a food columnist for the daily press, for newspapers and such like and just like. Also, then the question presents itself that when I've read I've gone through both your books, especially the parts with explication in them as opposed to having recipes in them.
Right.
And what I really noticed about your books as opposed to many others is that for you, food is a cultural journey as well as a culinary experience. So, and nowhere is this more evident than in your second book, which is, Pangat.
Pangat, yes.
Where you actually go through the geographical you locate each culinary community in its geographical area, its setting, its climatic conditions and so forth, and you try to bring in the cultural element into it. How did you? I mean, of course, food is a very evocative and cultural thing, but why did you? Is there an archival reason behind it? That do you want to create a time capsule of food culture? What is the motivation behind creating a cultural food book, if I may call it that?
Because it's the only way, it's the only lens through which I can view food. It's like approaching any academic subject without placing it in context. It's not going to make any sense. it's like learning a language without knowing the alphabet. So yeah, so that's pretty much it, also, I think a lot. So my second book, Pangat, is dedicated to my maternal grandmother, because primarily she never taught me to cook. She never really made me sit in the kitchen and say, okay, so this is the recipe. We start with this, and then we follow it up with that, and you cook it for 15 minutes or whatever. It was never that. But she was always talking about food, whether or not I was in the kitchen, if we were in the dining table or she was reading something. And she was always able to make these connections, between food and some sort of a story, or the food that we eat here and something that she ate in another town, or, when she was growing up in a small town in Karnataka. So placing those dishes in context always helped to understand why a certain region or a certain community eats a certain thing. And I felt in some measure that Maharashtrian cuisines are misrepresented, misinterpreted, because they are not contextualized. It's just seen as the cuisine of this region, and then you equate it with misal pav, vada pav, and
Pohe,
that
yes,
kind,
absolutely.
and kolhapuri. Kolhapuri is a thing.
Oh, absolutely.
And so I've always talked about how the cuisine of Kolhapur is actually, it suffers such misrepresentation, because when you walk into a standard issue urban restaurant and you order anything Kolhapuri, what you get is a fiery red curry. It could have paneer in it for all you know, but it's I mean, people from Kolhapur will, turn into a grave. But the cuisine of Kolhapur is actually very, very sophisticated if you look at it. I mean, of course, there is the royal lineage and all of that, but, very basic Kolhapuri fare is also very, very sophisticated in its use of spices. And when I say spices, I don't mean heat. The problem with Kolhapuri cuisine, as we understand it in current parlance, is that it is hot and red and fiery, but it's not. Not all dishes are, smoke from your ears and all of that. There are some very, very mild dishes. And it's not always red. There are white curries, there are yellow curries, there are green curries. There's all sorts of meat being used. It's not just chicken. I think I basically don't like chicken, so I have issues with people who equate non-vegetarian food with chicken. But primarily in Maharashtra, most of the regions would eat goat or lamb or and game, right? So especially in Kolhapur. So I think these are dishes that one needs to talk about, and then, unless you place it in the context, it's not going to make sense. So that's pretty much where it started. But Pangat also was about me trying to understand and me trying to discover the cuisine of the land I grew up in, but didn't know enough about. So I grew up in a certain community, and when I got married, I came to a building in which the majority population belonged to another community, and it was such a fantastic world, to enter, because this whole concept of the fisherwoman coming to your doorstep every other day is such, it's an education. I have learned so much from my fisherwoman. It's not funny.
Right.
So going from a primarily vegetarian family that never even cooked seafood or meat in the house, to actually getting the fisherwoman home and she demonstrating and making me break the crab legs and then, grind them and then strain them for a crab curry was fairly extreme, I think. But it was a very important learning, and I'm very happy about it.
Absolutely. That's a beautiful episode, which also you have dwelt upon in Pangat, which, your Vatsala, your fisherwoman.
Yes.
But to come to a related point, that while for most non-Maharashtrians, Maharashtrian cuisine, if that term can be used at all, is reduced to a few stereotypes seen in movies, whatever. But for many people of Maharashtra, food is wrapped not only in memories and nostalgia, but also in a very aggressive regionalism.
Yes.
A certain assertive vector of religion and community, of
Yes.
course.
Yes.
In your, so there is a dark side to identity politics in Maharashtra when it comes to food. In your estimation, is it increasing? Is it changing? What is happening there?
Unfortunately, I think it's increasing, and it's worrisome. I think when you see it in the younger generation, when you see people in their 20s saying things like "ये तो सिर्फ हमारे community में बनता है," and I'm not talking just of Maharashtra. I'm talking about the country.
Yeah.
But across communities, when the youth start saying things like this is only made in our community, and it's such a misinformed and dangerous claim. So I think it's worrisome for sure. I'll give you one other example. Very recently, so okay, there is this little chapter in my book in Pangat about the food of the widows. And initially when I was writing it, my publisher was a little hesitant because, it's not something that, it's a book about food and it's supposed to be pleasant and happy and all of that. And here one is trying to bring about a discussion on something that is fairly taboo. So I was talking about it to somebody and they said, but why have you written about it at all? Because it doesn't exist in Maharashtra. And I said, what are you talking about? I mean, how did you arrive at this? So she said, and this is a very senior woman. This is somebody in their 80s and somebody who's lived in urban India, in Mumbai all their lives. And she said, but this doesn't exist in Maharashtra. I've read about it in stories from Bengal, etc., but not in Maharashtra. And it primarily happens in areas of, where food doesn't come from a position of plenty, basically. So all of these narratives. And I said, no, but this is untrue because there are stories, very ghastly stories coming from Maharashtra and coming from the higher classes of Maharashtra. And so we need to accept it. Most of our communities, I think, are in denial about this aspect of food. And we tend to concentrate only or rather take pride in the little things like, हमारे यहाँ तो यही बनता है या सिर्फ हमारे यहाँ ये बनता है, which is not true. So in a related example, there is a dish called Anarchy in Maharashtra, which is basically rice flour that has been fermented. It has been mixed with jaggery and has been left to ferment for a while, and then it is fried on poppy seeds. There is a similar dish in the south, in Tamil Nadu, called Adiyasam.
I see.
It is essentially the same thing. It is rice flour and jaggery that has been fermented for a while. It is, in fact, served as prasad in most of the temples. If you go up north as far as Uttarakhand, there is a dish called arse, which is again the same thing, which is rice flour and jaggery that has been fermented. So I think this just goes to show that it's basically one dish. It travels. We don't know where it
how or where
birth and how it what trajectory it followed, etc. But the fact is that regions that grow the same grains, process their sugar in a similar way, tend to make the same things. If you go to Kerala, you'll find another interpretation. You go to Bengal, you'll find another interpretation. So for us to say, yaar, anarse to sirf hamare yahan bante is terribly wrong. The only addition that you ever made to it was add poppy seeds. So I think that humility is very important, to first accept that we are not the know-all. And there may be something unique to the cuisine, but more often than not, there is a parallel in another universe.
Absolutely. And it is surprising that you should say that this sort of competitive food regionalism, or whatever you call it, is thriving, sadly, in this hyper-connected time when
Yes.
When there are food blogs online, there are Facebook food groups, there are any number of ways for recipes and for food memes and food culture to travel across geographies. But
I think it comes down to what your motivation is. If your motivation is to study food and to expand your horizons and to learn about more recipes and to you know, and to use food as a unifying force,
yes,
then you will be able to see these differences. But if your primary provocation is to divide and to you know, rest on this superiority, then you're not going to see these you know, similarities at all. You're going to be so blinkers.
absolutely.
And it's conditioning, right? If in your family, if the dining table discussion is like that, then you tend to grow up like that.
Absolutely.
So unless somebody or something comes along and shows you that, you know, you've lived a very
sheltered
blinkered existence. Yeah.
Absolutely. That's a wonderful yes. Which again, and speaking of how in the hyper-connected age or in current times, food culture is changing, I'd like to turn your attention to the metros where you know, big food, as I call it, food corporations have been trying pretty much ever since liberalization to change our food habits. And nowhere is this more obvious than in the breakfast sector, where, you know, now it is petering out, but there was a time in the aughts and in the 90s when food corporations, whether of this country or other countries, were trying to get us to change our breakfast habits. So in your opinion, why, and probably it failed, it didn't work. Why do you think it didn't work? You know, why aren't we eating cornflakes for breakfast and washing it down with chocolate milkshakes? Why do we still, you know, why do we still reach for sabudana khichdi and poha and goshti?
Yeah. So I think you're absolutely right. It doesn't show up as clearly in any other segment apart from, you know, as it does in the breakfast segment. And very recently, I was working with a breakfast brand, and they were struggling to, you know, introduce, you know, the Western idea of cereals. They're still struggling to get us to eat cornflakes. I mean, yes, cornflakes are now available at the local kirana very, very easily, as they were in the 90s also. But, you know, like you very rightly said, more often than not, you get a craving for an idli or a dosa or pohe or even a paratha. But, and why is that? And I think there's just one very, very simple answer to that across the globe, not just in India. And that is the element of comfort, the element of familiarity. So even if you look at popular burger chains, they're trying to make region-specific changes, right? And those are the ones that actually work for the brand rather than the classics, as they're called. So I think it just comes down, like you very rightly said, to nostalgia, to comfort. And I think in some way our DNA is sort of just wired that way. You know, you even if you haven't grown up eating parathas for breakfast, when you go up north for a holiday and you get a hot paratha, you'd much rather eat that than a bowl of oatmeal.
Absolutely so. Absolutely so. But one food that was, one food that came to India and which forms the subject of your first book, although of course some communities did have leavened bread even before. We're speaking of the widespread acceptance of bread, which like you have pointed out, you know, came to India relatively later. And you've devoted a whole book to it. You've devoted one whole book to bread. And before we launch into that discussion, I'd really like to ask you why bread was that. Why did bread become so widespread that even in those cliched descriptions of food that make us cringe, vada pav, the pav is a Portuguese bread.
Yes.
So what was it about
So
bread?
the vada pav, actually, like my friend, the archaeologist Kurush Dalal likes to, talk about all the time, is vada pav is actually a Portuguese dish in entirety, because the
Absolutely.
pav, the potato, and the chili, all three primary components came to us from there. So it has
Absolutely.
nothing to do with India or Maharashtra.
Absolutely.
But yeah, coming to bread, I think bread has always had that, and I'm not just talking about wheat bread in general, whether it's a bhakri or it is a siddu or it is a tingmo or, or any other kind of bread, is so directly associated with comfort. Also, nutritionally speaking, because it has now become the primary source of carbohydrate in your diet. It gives you, the sugars, gives you a high, and therefore is very comforting. It's like eating candy, basically, and which is why it became so easily accepted. It is also easy to prepare, because you can make it and you can store it for a few hours longer. Earlier, if you were eating makki ki roti, or bajre ki roti, or a jwari ki bhakri, you would have to make it and eat it immediately off the flame. Otherwise, it would be, in another hour or so, it's going to be hard and dry and brittle and not particularly enjoyable, except for people like my grandmother who prefer it that way. But so I think it had a very easy sort of appeal from the perspective of preparation, from the perspective of it being a very easy, nutritive source of energy. So yeah, I think that primarily. But as far as leavened bread is concerned and the Western idea of bread is concerned, I don't think it was very, very widely accepted across ages till at least the 70s, if not more. There were people in my grandmother's, generation who said, this is not something that we eat. So the children are going to eat bread, or we've got a half loaf of bread for the children, stories of that sort. But, or even misa, for instance, which is supposed to be the iconic representative dish of Maharashtra. More often than not, the older generation will not eat it with bread or with pav. They would rather eat it with a bowl of dahi. Similarly, for the vada pav, it is, most of the older generation will eat it on its own without the pav. So I think that acceptance was, in certain communities and in certain age groups, it came quite late.
Right. And of course, bread is a versatile food. It goes with curries, it goes with other stuff. Yeah. So, but again, coming back to your first book, which was about bread, you've tailored the recipes to various Indian climates because, as you said, the standard Western temperatures are different from our temperatures. Yes. If you follow those recipes to the T, you will end up with something different, something that is not to your liking. So would you tell us about the process that went into the making of Crumbs, and why you thought, and why this subject attracted you for a book?
Okay. So I had studied, like I said, when I was in college, I had the option of knocking off two subjects and taking up bakery and confectionery. And our political science teacher was particularly boring, so I dropped political science and and history, and I took bakery and confectionery. So I studied these two under Mr. Nimbuwala for 2 years, and I was making my own bread for the longest time, even after I got married and so on. Around that time, a friend of mine set up a studio and a cooking studio, a cooking school, so to speak. And she said, why don't you come and teach bread making? And that's where I got to interact with a lot of people who said that, we've tried bread recipes so many times and we've got all these beautiful books from abroad and it just doesn't seem to work. And that's when I realized that bread has not been written about in the Indian context at all. There are books on parathas, there are books on how to make roti and videos on how to make the perfect pulka. But back when I started writing the book or even thinking about the book, there wasn't anything in that context. So it's not just the climate, it's not just the temperatures, but it's also about the protein content in the flour that is available to you. The strains of wheat that are grown in India are different from the strains of wheat that are grown in the Western world. Our wheat is weaker. And so we're looking at a protein content of 10 to 12%, whereas bread flour, which is the prescribed flour for bread making in the Western world, would have a protein content of at least 13 to 14%, and that makes quite a difference in the texture of the bread. So I wanted to write about recipes that can be made using your local atta and maida. And what is the stone ground spelt and this and that? We don't even get spelt in India. So I just wanted to, simplify the jargon. Stone ground is basically chakki ka atta. But the moment you say stone ground bread flour, people tend to get very intimidated. So that was one thing, the kind of flour, then the kind of temperatures, because Western books would ask you to make your dough and then leave it for proofing for at least 2 hours or whatever. But if you keep it for that long in a Bombay summer, which is crazy humid, your bread will rise and fall because the yeast is already dying in that much time. So I wanted to address all of those issues, and so that's pretty much how Crumbs happened.
What's your favorite bread?
That's a very difficult question.
That's why I asked.
So if I were to talk about bread at large, then my favorite bread would have to be bhakri.
And leave it
dinner rolls, I think. Yeah, very simple. In Bombay, actually, they're called 8 number ka bread because they're knotted like the number 8. So yeah.
Wonderful. So that's about Crumbs, which is of course available, I presume, on Amazon, both as a paperback and as a Kindle copy, which brings us to So basically, Crumbs, you saw that there was an unmet need for information. That is, how does bread work in India?
I think there was, that nostalgia element about bread that I associate very strongly with, and I know people do, but it needed to be written about, I think, and I was just having a ball writing about it, so I wrote it. So I just lucked out with it turning into a book. But since we were talking about bhakri, would it be all right if I read something about the bhakri from Crumbs? Do we have the time?
Please do. We can go beyond. We have a fairly elastic.
Okay.
We also started late, so.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is a small passage on bhakri from Crumbs, and it's about my grandmother's nanny and the kind of bread that she made, and a little story behind it. As the wife of an IAS officer, my maternal grandmother had traveled the world and enjoyed meals at the finest restaurants everywhere. But even today, if you ask her about the most memorable meal ever, she will probably tell you a little story about Bhimava, the domestic help employed in the large household that was a part of her childhood. Bhimava's duties, other than helping my great-grandmother with general afternoon jobs like cleaning grain and sorting vegetables, involved taking care of the many kids in the house, whom she had nicknamed after precious gems and metals according to a grading system that reeked of unapologetic favoritism. The most preferred child was, predictably, Hira or diamond, the costliest of precious stones. The least liked, German, inspired by German silver, low-lie alloy. Bhimava lived in a tiny hut of her own that stood just behind the sprawling two-storied house. After all her duties for the morning were done, the children fed and generally quietened, she would go back to her hut to fix herself a meal. Every day, provided that they had been on had been either on their best behavior or was simply enjoying the current status of being included among her favorites, a couple of the children would quite surreptitiously be invited over to her place for an afternoon treat. That special treat was a humble bhakri, a rustic flatbread typical to Maharashtra, Karnataka, and some parts of Gujarat and Rajasthan. Bhimava would throw an iron skillet on her wood-fired stove and beat out discs of soft jowar or bajra dough in her well-dusted, dented with age mixing basin or parat. With enviable dexterity, her dark, wrinkled hands would flap the discs on the hot skillet and immediately brush them with water. A quick flip, a brief wait, and the skillet would be briskly moved aside as the dry disc of bread was popped onto the naked flame. In seconds, it would puff up, its edges turning dark and smoky. Using her thumb and index finger as tongs, Bhimava would quickly rescue the bhakri from the fire and open it like a peter pocket. She would then reach for her barani of coarse, unprocessed salt, crush its contents with her bare fingers, sprinkle it over the bhakri, and hand over the treat to the eagerly waiting child or two who would wolf it down in the comfort of a warm, dark, smoke-filled hut.
Wonderful, absolutely wonderful. It's so layered, and there are so many layers, like a bhakri's layers, but or perhaps like a paratha's layers. There's nostalgia, there's food, there's a culture and region specific and community specific
and this was a story that my grandmother narrated to us over and over as she made the bhakri herself. You know, when we were children sitting in her kitchen on the countertop or on a stool, just listening to her. So, like I said earlier, she wasn't teaching me how to make the bhakri.
Yeah.
You know, it wasn't about, add 1 cup of water, 2 cups of flour or that kind of thing. I was just watching her. But she was telling me all of these stories. And every time I make the bhakri now, I'm thinking not of my grandmother, but of Bhimava.
Right.
And trying to imagine the flavor of the bhakri because of the wood-fired smoke and how I don't have access to that because I'm making it on, a gas stove.
Right.
So things like that, I think it's just
wonderful. Thank you for sharing that with us. It's a beautiful, heartwarming passage, which brings us to the second book. Speaking of the bhakri, it brings us to the second book, which is a wide-ranging exploration of cuisines and food culture, but mainly cuisines from various communities in Maharashtra.
Right.
And you dwelt on it a little bit before, but I'd like you to elaborate on that. How did Pangat come about? What was the motivation behind writing Pangat?
So like I said, I think it started with the realization that I don't know enough about my own cuisine. And before I started writing Pangat, I had started a little Facebook group called Pangat, where we wanted to, we wanted people to share traditional recipes. And now, which again brings me to a very problematic usage of the term authentic. People tend to use the word authentic very freely in the context of food, but I have problems with that term in the sense that how do you define what is authentic? So I'll give you an example. If you look at the cover of Pangat, I don't know if it's very clear, but this thing here is actually a vati of tomato sauce.
Yeah.
Okay? And there is batatachi bhaji here.
Yes.
So when my grandmother saw the cover of the book, she almost had this, have I not taught you better sort of expression on her face. And she said, why tomato sauce? And this is a naivedya prasad. This is what you offer, to the gods. And why do you have potatoes and tomatoes on your? I know we make it, and she's basically anti-tomato, but she said, couldn't you have put anything else there? Because potatoes and tomatoes are not traditional, they're not authentic. And I said, but they are authentic to my time, right? Tomato sauce and batata is something that we use all the time. And over so many generations now, potatoes are offered, are accepted ingredient in religious offerings. So of course we had a separate debate entirely. But this is just one example of how what is authentic to you in, say, the 1930s or the 1940s is no longer authentic to me sitting here in 2021.
Absolutely.
So that's where contextualization becomes very, very important. I've talked about this a lot in the book as well as otherwise, but the usage of tomato again, it's a fruit that came to us from somewhere else and came to us very, very recently and wasn't used so much until the 17th and 18th centuries. But it's so widespread now that even if you go to the smallest village and you ask them to make something traditional, even if they make bengan ka bhatta, chances are that they will add a tomato to it. And therefore, my thesis here is that tomatoes are now authentic to pretty much whether you like it or not. It's a reality.
Absolutely.
And they serve so many purposes, right? One, you can bulk up a dish. Two, it is easily available. So when tomatoes actually came to us, they were still a seasonal commodity. Even now, the tomatoes that you get in the winters are juicier, they have more flavor, and they're prettier even. They're more sour, all of that. But now you get tomatoes through the year. So we use them as a bulking agent, we use it as a souring agent, and of course we use it as salad and this and that and the other. In the process, what has happened is we've forgotten about a lot of other ingredients. Okay, so in Maharashtra, an amti is made differently by different communities,
yes.
Right?
Yes.
Depending on where you come from. So a standard issue dal would be soured using either tamarind, especially if you live in the plains, kokum if you live along the coast, raw mango if you're making it in the summer, dried raw mango if you're making it off season. And there were all of these options. Now it's just one tomato, chop it up and add it very quickly. What that has done is it has narrowed our repertoire, so to speak. And that is my problem with the tomato, not that it is inauthentic. It is real to our time because we're placing it in the context of today. But in doing so, we shouldn't forget about the ingredients that can provide so much variety and have provided so much variety and
so much taste.
And flavor.
I mean, and what I found very, very interesting about Pangat is that it introduced me to, especially me, because, traditionally the men are not exposed to as much of the behind the scenes, the cooking culture so much as we should be. So in a sense, it was a lot of learning experiences for me to go through Pangat and to see, ye masala, this masala is from this place, and all that, community specific, which was a beautiful, beautiful approach towards it. And as you said, hopefully it will reduce the boundaries between the artificial self-imposed, self-maintained boundaries between so-called different communities. What I did notice about Pangat is that while it is a very comprehensive book, there are some communities that don't find a mention in the book. So for instance, there are Dalit communities that I did not detect in the book. Was this a logistical issue? What was the
So two reasons. One, and the primary reason basically is that as we say in Marathi, madha abhyas navta. So I haven't studied the Dalit communities and their food in as much detail as I should if I were to represent it in an objective and reasonable manner. Unfortunately, and this again comes from the fact that certain communities have never had access to the written word and therefore are not documented. There is very little that has been written about Dalit cuisines, and therefore, if you were to look at it from an academic research point of view, you have one or two sources. There is one beautiful book, very disturbing, very real book written by Shahu Patore called Anna Hai Apurna Brahma.
Yes.
Yes. And there's another book that was brought out by the Maharashtra Sahitya body, which in my opinion was again a very biased and misrepresentative collection of recipes and information. So I didn't want to draw too much from that unless I actually went and did the research myself. And when I was writing both the books, I was very, very preoccupied. So I hadn't, and not just preoccupied, I tried to reach out to a few people who would give me information. I did get bits and pieces, but I wasn't able to thread it together, because these are subjects that are difficult for people to talk about. And so it's not very easy to verify the information. And I didn't want to put out something that I wasn't very sure about myself.
Absolutely.
So that was the primary reason. But I would also like to say that I'm working on it. So hopefully there will be another edition in the future sometime.
Wonderful. You heard it here first, guys. and all the best to you for that session.
Thank you.
We are almost reaching the end of the session, but we started late, so that so I'd just like to say to people listening in that if you have any questions, please type them in the chat box, and Saee and I will be able to read and respond to them. But Saee, I just want to also ask you, while those questions are coming in, is that you mentioned that there is a Facebook group called Pangat, which, where, tell us about that. Many people will be interested to see, go to that group and check
right.
it out.
So initially we started it as a closed group because we didn't want, information to get diluted, and because what tends to happen is the moment you start talking about food, people tend to talk about what they made for lunch, and so we didn't want to talk about bharli wangi and chole and Black Forest cakes all the time. We wanted to talk about cuisine, elements of the cuisine that are lost. So even if it were things like utensils that were traditionally used for certain things, or food and literature, how is it that food gets woven into oral literature like the Ovi or the Ukhana, or like a Badbar Geet, which is a nursery rhyme essentially. That was the primary reason for starting that group, because I wanted to understand for myself, and I had friends who wanted to also participate in this discovery of a cuisine that we grew up eating but don't know enough about. So that was why we started the group. It is now quite a large group. It is about 37,000 members. It is still a closed group. You have to seek permission because we wanted to filter out. It just becomes difficult for to manage things. So yeah, it is a large group. The discussion sometimes again gets diluted into what's happening for it's Chaturthi today. So what then there is this flood of modaks that comes in, and then the admin is like, oh my god. But on good days there are very interesting discussions about food and literature, and like I said, about utensils, about seasonal elements, or I got to learn a lot about ran bhaja, or the leafy green vegetables that come in the monsoon especially. So it really depends on the mood of the group, really.
Wonderful. And the focus is on Maharashtrian food, or it's on?
Yes, it is. It is.
The focus is on food from Maharashtra.
Yeah.
So we have a question.
And then again, the discussion tends to get a little difficult because the other day somebody said, okay, so if I put a recipe for Kolhapuri bhel, is it Maharashtrian cuisine or is it just, So how do you define that, And then all of us in the admin group tend to sit and break our heads over how do we define this? I mean, where did bhel originate? But now that Kolhapur has made it its own, it's adding a little bit of rasta, it's adding farsan, it's adding fried peanuts and this and that. It's become a Kolhapuri thing. So do we accept it as Maharashtrian cuisine? These are difficult questions to answer, but I think also very relevant ones, and I'm glad that people ask them.
Absolutely so. And I mean, while we're speaking of misal, for instance, I should tell you that when I was a daily reporter roving around the city, I had this sort of side hustle of trying to find out the best misal places in Bombay.
Huh.
And as everybody knows, or as I don't know, many people might not, the Bombay misal, especially the misal you find in Lal Bagh, central Bombay, Marathi speaking dominant areas of Bombay, is very different from the misal you will find in, let's say, rural areas of Pune.
Absolutely.
And so on and so forth until you reach the very borders of the very area where misal is no longer found. So this very idea of what constitutes a Maharashtrian cuisine, or for that matter, any pan-regional cuisine, is fraught with, it's a dicey procedure, I would suggest.
Absolutely. And then again, the point about placing it in context comes into play. So I went for a walk with a friend of mine who conducts food walks in Pune, and he took me to a place where apparently the misal originated. Okay, and this is so I went, and it was a most delicious misal, but it had no sprouts at all. It was basically pohe and aloo ki sabzi, and then there was the curry, and it was served with a slice of bread. And I said, where are the sprouts? And I said, no, but this is the original misal, it has no sprouts. And then you come to the Bombay misal or to the Kolhapuri misal, and the Bombay misal is so different from the Kolhapuri misal. The Kolhapuri misal is different from the Nashik misal. So what is the definition of a misal? Somebody asked me very recently, what is the difference between an usad and a misal? So I said the usad is basically a curry made using sprouts. And a misal basically means a mixture. Okay, it's a mishmash of things. So it really depends on what you want to add to it. Absolutely. Whether you want to add the usad and a couple of other things and make it a misal, or just make your own concoction.
Yeah.
It's a very broad spectrum application of the term. So yeah, that's why I say, it's important to understand where that word came from. Why did we start calling it misal? We started calling it misal because we were using leftovers, putting them together and making a dish.
Absolutely. So, and now we have a question. Divya is asking you, what is the one food trend that is going to pick up according to you in 2021-22?
I think the only trend that is going to stay, it's not just in this year, but in general, is going back to your roots, trying to rediscover what your ancestors ate. And by ancestors, I don't mean your grandparents and your great grandparents, etc., but people that you share a geographical region with. What is in your DNA? What was grown? And discovering that, I think, is going to be the trend that is pretty much here to stay. If we were to now, look at how we eat grains, we will find that this whole gluten intolerance, etc., although it's new, it's not very new, because India as a country was not gluten heavy, gluten dependent to start with. At one point in time in the ancient texts, etc., it's written that wheat is actually not allowed for religious context at all. So what did we eat then? We ate rice and we ate barley. And barley is a grain that is now pretty much out of our, everyday repertoire. It makes an appearance in fancy restaurants when you eat it as a barley risotto or a salad, but nobody is making jaw ki roti anymore because it's not so easily available. If you take it to the local, the mill, he will look at you with, मैं क्या करूँ इसका? How do you want this ground? And I'll have to do it another time because I've got wheat going and I can't mix the two grains, etc. But even jowar and bajra are grains that came to us from Africa many, many thousands of years ago. So in a sense, they are not indigenous to India. They are domesticated in India. So we have been primarily a rice-eating nation. So in terms of trends, I think the more we go ahead, the more we go back. We need to dig a little bit and find out what it is that we ate and why is it that suddenly we have gluten intolerance. We have it because thanks to, post-emergency and the Green Revolution and all of that, wheat was thrust upon us. It wasn't a grain of choice.
Absolutely. There's another question coming in. Anisha asks, what will your next book be about?
I should ask my publisher since they've been sitting on it. But one book that's due to come out is a rewriting and a new edition of my first book, the Gore family cookbook, which is something that I wrote even before Crumbs. It was written for a private audience, for the family, because there was this large scale get together and there was to be some sort of souvenir. And because we've been a foodie family, and that's when I realized that because it's been a family that has sort of traveled a lot and married into other communities, and we eat a lot of things that are just not Maharashtrian at all. That is, I think, the next book.
Wonderful. We look forward to it with anticipation. So we are almost at the end of the session. Is there anything that you would like to say which I haven't addressed in my questions or otherwise?
No, I just want to say this was great fun because I have seen the PEN Prithvi sessions from the other side, being in the audience, and now to be here is quite an honor. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you so much. We are recording this session and it will be uploaded on YouTube, where it will be available to all and archived there. So Saee, thank you so much for joining us today. Stay safe, everybody. Stay safe, Saee. This is PEN Prithvi, a fortnightly online program where we speak with writers from India and beyond, writing in various languages and various genres and topics. Follow us on Instagram and Twitter, PEN Prithvi, and our YouTube handle is PEN Prithvi Webcast. So see you next fortnight, and thank you again, Saee. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.